Police were called to an apartment because someone heard the sounds of a woman screaming. Police arrived, they looked around, they saw nothing, they heard nothing, they left. 30 minutes later, that woman was dead. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Andrea DelVesco. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we get started, of course, please make sure if you want to see shorter form true crime stories from me, head on over to my TikTok, which is also called Making a True Crimerer, where I have a couple of thousand videos over there for you to view. Alright, so let's get right into this case. Andrea DelVesco was born on June 29th, 1994 in Chicago, Illinois, but they wouldn't live there for very long. The family would eventually move to Austin, Texas, which is really where they called home. Andrea would eventually go to St. Andrew's Episcopal School, and she would end up graduating from there, from high school, in 2012. She was a very busy student while going to school there. She played on the field hockey team. She was on the lacrosse team. She won spelling bee awards. She won other awards for her academic achievements in Latin, in Spanish. She was a national commended merit scholar, and she was almost a straight A student. She was accepted into UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, and she started there pretty much right after high school, so in 2012. She was studying Latin culture, and she was going for a double major in both Spanish and in psychology. While at school, she was a leader in the Honor Society. She was also a leader in the National Charity League, and she was also a leader in her sorority house, which was Pi Beta Phi. Andrea did not just excel in academics, she was also an excellent just person in general. She would actually win the K. Hart Community Service Award. And this was for her generosity and her working with the public. She would volunteer to help in the community at any time she could. If she had free time, she would use it to volunteer. This would include working in homeless shelters and animal shelters. She was a humongous animal lover. In fact, she had her own little dog, a little chihuahua. On top of all of this, she was a very adventurous person, very outdoorsy. She was incredibly well-traveled. You know, she bonded with villagers in Peru. She bungee jumped in South Africa. Andrea was not described as a person who would let any kind of fear of something get in her way. She was a very curious person. They said even since she was a child, she was always trying to just figure things out. She was really good at reading people, and she was able to use that in her just high capacity to help others. She always knew when something was bothering someone, and she always knew the right thing to do to lift that person's spirits. She was described as someone who is the most gentle person they ever met, the kindest soul they ever met. She never asked for anything in return. Basically, it all sounds like this is someone that we all would have loved to have known. So Andrea, at the time of the story, was living in an apartment building, which I think was converted into a dorm, if I'm not mistaken. And she lived in a pretty large apartment with 5 total roommates, plus her dog. And this was literally just like a block away from UCLA. The apartment complex they lived in was just off of Roebling Avenue. On the evening of September 20th, 2015, Andrea and her roommates were all in the living room studying and getting some stuff done for some classes at school. It was reported by her roommates that Andrea fell asleep sometime around 10 p.m. and she passed out on the couch. On the morning of September 21st, 2015, one of her roommates said that they walked out to the living room sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning, and they noticed that Andrea was on the couch still, fast asleep. The roommate made note that Andrea had her red Snuggie blanket pulled over her. At approximately 5:50 a.m., one of her roommates, Samantha, would leave the apartment to go do a quick errand on the campus. And at 5:50 in the morning, when she left, Andrea was still on the couch, asleep. When the roommate returned home at approximately 6:30 in the morning, she noticed that Andrea was no longer on the couch and that Andrea's bedroom door was closed. Now let's rewind just a little bit. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, a man who was a cook on the UCLA campus was on Roebling Avenue near Andrea's apartment. And he was out there collecting cans for recycling. So a little after 5:30 a.m., he reported seeing a little red vehicle, possibly a Sentra. And inside the vehicle were two men, and they both appeared to be intoxicated. Maybe they were high. He wasn't really sure, but they were both like laughing and being pretty loud in the car. While this witness was out there collecting cans, one of the men got out of the car from the passenger side, approached the witness and said, "Hey, do you know how to fight?" And the witness was like, "No, what?" Apparently, this witness said it almost came off like in a joking manner. And it was kind of hard to take it seriously because, again, the guy appeared to be drunk or high or something. But he said something along the lines of, "Well, we're going to go break into these chicks' apartment, and we're not sure if any guys are there, so we might need help fighting them." And the witness was like, "Okay, bud." And then he just sort of walked away. And he then noticed that this man walked towards the apartment building where Andrea lived with her roommates. Okay, now we're at a second witness. At 5:35 a.m., Andrea's upstairs neighbor was going into her apartment. She had just dropped off her boyfriend at the airport. As the witness put her key into the lock to turn it, and just as she's about to open the door, she notices someone running from the stairwell towards the parking lot, and this appeared to be a man. The neighbor, she texted her boyfriend and said, "Hey, I just saw some guy running away from an apartment. Should I call campus security?" The boyfriend was like, it's probably nothing. Now, at 6:15 a.m., the neighbor hears a female screaming and the sounds of a dog barking and whimpering as if it were in pain. She was pretty sure the screaming came from the apartment down below, which she referred to as Andy's apartment because everyone called Andrea Andy. This time, the neighbor didn't mess around. She immediately called 911. At 6:23 a.m., 4 police officers arrive on the scene. They speak to the witness, the neighbor. She, again, gives her account of what she heard. Again, she says, "I think it came from Andy's apartment, Andrea's apartment." The neighbor then just goes back into her apartment. And according to police records, what the 4 cops did was they did not knock on the door of Andrea and her roommate's apartment. What they did was they basically circled the apartment with their flashlights because it was still pretty dark outside, and they began looking in the windows. And now this whole time they don't hear anything. They don't hear screaming, they don't hear any dogs making noises, they hear nothing. And as they're looking into the apartment with the flashlights, at one point they scan the flashlight over what would eventually be, they would learn, was Andrea's bed. And they said they had no recollection of seeing anyone in the bed itself. As a matter of fact, everything looked normal and it looked empty. By 6:30 a.m., the cops left. Just 30 minutes after they left, at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, the neighbor who called 911 originally then heard a very loud bang, and she described it as if it was the French doors to the balcony below being swung open forcibly. And then when she went to go look, she saw a man bolting out from that balcony, which would be the neighbor below, and wrapped around him was a red Snuggie blanket. And she said that this man was the same person she had seen earlier running towards the parking lot. She screamed at this person, "What are you doing? What do you want?" Kind of, just sort of reactively screaming. And that's when she noticed smoke billowing out of the room below where the French doors were. And then she noticed flames. So she immediately calls 911 again, says, "You guys were just here. You said nothing was going on. Now there's a freaking fire in the apartment below, the apartment I said someone was screaming in." She was able to kind of track the guy from her balcony, and she saw him get into the passenger side of a little red vehicle, possibly a Sentra. Now quickly, the roommate's account. To me, I haven't been able to find all of the aspects to this, but with 5 roommates in this apartment, I'm not sure why they didn't notice police looking around, why they didn't hear possibly the scream and the dog whimpering. I don't know. But around 7 o'clock in the morning, one of the roommates recalls hearing a faint alarm going off, possibly like a smoke alarm. And then the roommate heard the screaming of the upstairs neighbor who was screaming, "What are you doing? What do you want?" towards the person who was running away. The roommate then gets up and she walks towards Andrea's bedroom, where she notices a little bit of smoke coming out from the door. She opens it and it's a nightmare. She sees Andrea on the bed covered in blood, and she is completely engulfed in flames. So all the roommates who were in there were obviously panicking and screaming. There was nothing they could do for her because, at that point, Andrea wasn't screaming, so they assumed the worst. They all immediately called 911. They all left the apartment, of course. So now all these people are calling the cops, and by 7:10 a.m., firefighters, the ambulance, the cops are all there on scene. It did take them about 35 to 40 minutes or so to actually get all of the fire extinguished. And most of the fire was centered on Andrea's bedroom. The remainder of the apartment was in fairly good condition still. The fire was finally put out. They then noticed the charred remains of a body on Andrea's bed. And eventually they would determine that that was in fact the body of Andrea. Unfortunately, her dog, her little Chihuahua, also experienced a lot of injuries, had some burn wounds, and unfortunately the dog would pass away as well. So during her autopsy, they came to the conclusion that Andrea was stabbed bare minimum 19 different times. She had fatal wounds to her neck and her chest. Her body was in such a bad state of, obviously it was burned, so they could not determine if she was sexually assaulted or not. They had no evidence either way. The arson people would determine that the fire was deliberately started, of course, and it was started by placing a trash can on top of the bed with all the trash coming out, and they lit that on fire and that spread. So, police began their investigation. Now, I do want to state from this point that I know for a fact that I think it was the 2 officers who initially were looking through the apartment with the flashlights during the initial call. I believe it was those 2 that were eventually fired from the police department. At the same time, the police wouldn't acknowledge that whether or not, had they gone in the apartment at that time, if Andrea would still be alive today. They couldn't determine that, so they wouldn't really admit that the police officers would have prevented it, but then they were also fired, so it's I don't know. Police also found out that this was not the first crime that happened on Roebling Avenue that particular morning. Right across the street from where Andrea lived, there was an apartment that was broken into. From that apartment, a laptop was stolen and 2 Sonos speakers, very expensive, high-end speakers, were stolen from this apartment. By sheer dumb fuckery of the people who stole these speakers, the very next day, Sonos would contact the police saying that, hey, you recently reported that this particular serial number of speaker was stolen. Well, someone just tried to register the speakers so they could set them up in their own home. And this was at a home in Fresno, California. The roommate, when police got there, said that the speakers were given to him by his roommate, and his name was Alberto Medina. His roommate claimed that Alberto gave him the speakers because he said a friend of his was moving and was just giving things away because they couldn't bring everything. And the roommate just believed it. And that's, that's on him, but whatever. Alberto Medina, I believe, was about 25 years old at the time, and he was studying at Fresno University. One of Alberto's very best friends was a man by the name of Eric Marquez, and he was actually studying at UCLA, and he lived just about a block away from where Andrea lived. Alberto and Eric had been friends since high school. But at any rate, when police were at the apartment in Fresno, when they were talking to the roommate said that Alberto Medina also stored a bunch of stuff in the garage they had that was with the apartment, and he allowed police to look inside, and there he found stolen items from the apartment on Roebling Avenue, the one that was across the street from Andrea. According to the roommate, Medina told him that he said something like, yeah, I guess some chick was murdered over by UCLA, and she was, sexually assaulted, and I think they said she was set on fire. And then, oddly, he told the roommate, he said, I don't think the person who did it's ever going to get caught. I don't know, what? So, this is when police would arrest Alberto Medina, mainly for the robbery first. They wanted to bring him in for questioning, so they had enough evidence to arrest him for that burglary. During this super long questioning and interrogation, Alberto would say that while he was robbing the apartment for the speakers and the laptop and all that, his buddy, Eric Marquez, who drove a little red Nissan Sentra, he had gone across the street to the apartment complex, and he broke into that girl's apartment and he killed her. Medina said that Marquez seemed super cocky about it. He was full of himself. He looked proud of himself, but he also came off as just super cold. Well, they still got a warrant to search Medina's apartment. In the apartment, they found a knife with bloodstains on it. They also find a big black plastic trash bag, and inside that bag was a red Snuggie blanket. They also found a blood-stained tank top, and also a pair of women's underwear. When they eventually questioned Marquez, they also got a warrant to search his red Nissan. And in the trunk, they found a pair of black socks, also with blood on it. They also found traces of blood on the outside passenger door. All of the blood samples that came from all of the items police collected, every single one of those samples matched Andrea DelVesco. But the majority of the evidence was actually pointing towards Medina being the killer because he seemed to keep all of the trophies, as it were. And they also did sexual assault kits on both men, or tests, I guess. And Marquez had no scratches, no bruises. He had no indication that there was anything of a struggle going on around his body. But when Medina was examined, he had a whole bunch of fresh scratches. He had bruises. It looked like he was getting the shit kicked out of him by someone. With all of the evidence they collected, they determined that it was actually Medina who killed Andrea. And based on the witness testimony from the man who was collecting cans outside, Marquez was waiting in the vehicle for Medina to be done what he thought was just robbing the place. So, Alberto Medina was charged with murder, he was charged with arson, he was charged with burglary, and he was also charged with animal cruelty. On May 29th, 2018, he would go to trial, and he would eventually be found guilty, convicted, and of all counts, by the way. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for like the murder charges, the arson, and then they tacked on an additional 11 years for the other crimes like the burglary and the animal cruelty. Eric Marquez would plead guilty to burglary and also accessory after the fact, and he was given a very light sentence of just 2 years and 8 months. Many people can't help but wonder about the police's response. It's a very hotly contested issue when it came to this case. Like I said, the two officers who responded initially, by the way, it was the two senior officers, and they were like training two other officers. That's great. So the two senior officers, from what I understand, were the two that were fired. Again, they don't know if they would have been able to save anyone's life, because when they got to the apartment and looked inside, Andrea wasn't on the bed. There was no fire. But they don't know if she was already stabbed to death, or maybe if, Alberto was in there, like maybe covering her mouth and preventing her from screaming and hiding. It's not really known. It's such a small window of time that ultimately you kind of have to think she was probably already dead. But again, we'll never really know. I also don't know the layout of this apartment, but with 5 roommates, I have to imagine it's a pretty big place. So again, I don't know how they didn't hear any of this, like any struggles, how they didn't hear the initial screaming that the 911 call was made for originally. I'm not sure. The point of entry was likely through Andrea's balcony, because the French doors on her balcony were actually broken, so they didn't lock properly. So that's how they believe the person got in. So it's not like they went in through, the living room and made a ruckus in there. From what it sounds like, Andrea must have woken up sometime after her roommate left at 5:50 and walked into her bedroom and closed the door. And then that's when Medina came in. Again, that's just speculation. Such a small window of time, and so much happened in that small window of time. But at least the monster is now behind bars forever, and he'll never be able to hurt anyone again. I am glad that the police did take some accountability by firing those 2 officers. I just wish we knew if more could have been done. Andrea DelVesco was a hell of a person, and she was on her way to becoming an even better person and probably contributing so much greatness to our world. And it's just very sad that was all taken away from her family and friends and the world in general. But that is it for this case. I hope you found the story interesting. If you guys have any cases you would like me to cover, you can send me an email to mikey@truecrimerer.com. I will put that in the description below. But please make sure you check my case list first. It's public. Go to my link tree, also below, and check my case list. Scroll through it. If you want to search, if you're on a computer, hit Control F. If you're on a phone, hit the 3 dots at the top and choose Find and Replace, and then you can put in the name and search. If that name that you want me to cover does not come up, then send me just a really quick email with some very basic information, and then I can add it to my list. And again, I have a whole lot more smaller cases over on my TikTok. I have about 2.6 million followers at the time of this video, and that's where I got my start for doing all of this. So if you do have TikTok and you want to check it out, by all means, follow me over there. And lastly, if you would like to purchase any merch from my brand, I guess, in the link tree is also my merch store where we sell t-shirts and hoodies with different sayings and quotes and stuff on them. We have mugs, and we have a wine glass, and we have little tiny trinket things, all made dearly by my friend Adam, logically.me on TikTok. His info's below as well. He makes everything himself. He does all my designing for everything, and he will ship worldwide. So wherever you are in the world, as long as you're okay with paying the astronomical shipping fees they charge these days, yeah, he can ship to you wherever you are. All right, so that is it for today, folks. And until the next case, ta-ta for now. True crime, knees. Stop trying things, Mike.